If you went to Sunday school, you were probably taught some basic facts about the authors of the New Testament. For example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the four Gospels, the accounts of the life of Jesus. And Paul the Apostle wrote all 13 letters that bear his name. Right? My guest Bart Ehrman says, not exactly. He's something of a biblical iconoclast. Ehrman has been investigating questions like these for years, trying to determine what biblical writings are authentic and which are, well, forgeries. His latest book is called Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. We first spoke this March. Now, your book is about forgeries, so what do you mean by that word?
Right. So when I use the term forgery, I'm using it in a very specific sense, in which I mean somebody who writes a book claiming to be someone other than who they are in order to deceive his readers. So that forgery involves a false authorial claim.
And did it mean the same thing 2,000 years ago as it does today?
Yes, this is one of the things that biblical scholars haven't grasped as clearly as they need to, I think, and one of the points of my book is that in the ancient world, when they talked about this phenomenon of authors claiming to be someone other than who they were, the ancient people called these kinds of books lies, and they considered it to be a deceitful practice, and they condemned it in almost every instance when they talked about it. So in many ways it is very much like it is today, with the one difference being that in the ancient world it wasn't illegal because there weren't laws about such things, but people who did this sort of thing who were caught were usually punished for it.
Now, let's look at some specific books, and let's begin with the four Gospels. And these are the accounts of the life of Jesus that provide a real bedrock for Christian teaching. And a lot of Christians, hearing what I said in the introduction, would say, wait a minute, what do you mean these weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How can you say that?
Yes, well, no, it's a good question. Now, in this case, we're not dealing with forgeries because whoever wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not claim to be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Those are titles given to the books later by editors. The books themselves don't make any claims, so they're actually anonymous. And so in this case, these would be called false ascriptions rather than forgeries, but scholars for a long time have argued that they weren't really written by Matthew and John, two of Jesus' disciples, and Mark and Luke, companions of the apostles, that in fact the disciples of Jesus were probably Aramaic-speaking, illiterate peasants who couldn't write. These books are written in a very high-level Greek by people living 30 or 40 years later.
Do we know who actually wrote them?
We don't know. All we know is that they certainly were not the followers of Jesus, who spoke Aramaic and were lower-class peasants without an education. These books are written by highly educated Greeks, probably living outside of Palestine, 40 or 50 years later. But since they're anonymous, we really don't know who the authors were.
What's the evidence that these were not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Is it just the fact that they were illiterate Aramaic speakers, or is there any other evidence?
That's a large part of the evidence. The other thing is that they aren't actually called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for over 100 years after they were written. And so church fathers at the end of the 2nd century, 100 years later, start calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they were originally circulated anonymously, and they originally did not have titles in them, the Gospel according to Matthew. Whoever called it the Gospel according to Matthew was somebody telling you who, in his opinion, wrote the book. But his opinion was formed decades later, and so there's very little evidence to suggest that they were really written by the people that they're ascribed to.
Is there any evidence that each one was written by one person only? Because I have heard that the Gospels can be seen as collections of the memories of the early Christian communities about Jesus.
Yes, that's a really good point. Since these weren't written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, so there's nothing spectacular about this kind of scholarship, but they're written by people 40 or 50 years later, and so you wonder, well, where did they get their information from? And the general thought among scholars is that Christians were telling stories about Jesus as they were trying to convert other people and trying to educate Christians, and these stories were in circulation year after year after year until these gospel writers, these anonymous individuals, heard the stories and then wrote them down. It may be that a couple of the Gospels actually had more than one author. For example, the Gospel of John, there are passages that don't look like they come from the same pen as the rest of the Gospel, and so there may be multiple authors in a couple of cases.
Now let's look at the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, because they pose a different problem. Now, these are letters, of course, to early Christian communities that contain both basic Christian teachings and often insights into the history of the very early church. Now, you and a number of other biblical scholars say he almost certainly wrote some of the 13, but he didn't write others. So, for starters, which ones did he write, in the opinion
Yes.
of most scholars?
Yes, this is common among scholars to recognize that Paul wrote 7 of the 13 letters. They're sometimes called the undisputed Pauline epistles. So they would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. They're the 7 books that cohere well together, and they're easily situated in Paul's lifetime, and they represent the same sorts of theological views, and so they all appear to have come from the same author, and almost everybody agrees that that author was Paul.
And which ones did he not write, or does it seem he didn't write?
Most people think that Paul did not write Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians, although there are debates about those 3. The other 3, there are far fewer debates. Most scholars don't think that Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus.
How do you know Paul didn't write these?
Yes, well, that's the important question. And if you have 7 letters that you're sure come from somebody, and then you have another letter that you're wondering about, then you compare it with the 7. You look at the writing style, you look at the vocabulary, you look at the theological points of view, you look at the historical situation that's being presupposed. You do a comparison with the other 7 and make a judgment.
Do we know who wrote the letters that are almost certainly not Paul?
No, unfortunately, we don't know what their names were. Probably the same person wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, so one author for those 3. And the other 3, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians, each had a different author. All we can say about these people is that they were living after Paul, so maybe closer to the end of the 1st century. They were people who revered Paul and had points of view that they wanted to express that they thought Paul would have expressed if he were still living today. And so they were confronted with new situations, and they wrote letters in order to deal with those situations, claiming to be Paul himself, knowing full well, of course, that they weren't Paul, and so that's why these should be labeled as forgeries.
You say they are actual forgeries. Why would somebody do that?
Yes, it's an interesting question because in the ancient world, this kind of literary activity was called lying. And the interesting irony with the Pauline letters is that a number of these letters are quite adamant that it's important to tell the truth. And so the irony is that in order to proclaim the truth, these unknown authors are lying. And so why would somebody do that? In the ancient world like today, there were a lot of people who thought that in some circumstances it's the right thing to do to lie. We have ancient examples of people saying things such as if a doctor has to lie to a patient in order to get her to take her medicine, then that's a good thing to do. And my guess is that these people who were writing these books, knowing that they weren't Paul, claiming to be Paul, simply thought that their message was so important that it was worthwhile lying about their identity so that more people would read their letters and would then accept the truth that they were trying to proclaim.
In other words, they thought they were nobodies, so they had to put a somebody name on it in order to be heard.
That's right. I mean, you get this throughout the early Christian tradition, of course. I mean, we're right now just talking about the New Testament, but if you were a nobody, if you were somebody named Jehoshaphat and you wrote a gospel and you called it the Gospel of Jehoshaphat, nobody would read the thing. But if you wanted people to read it, then you claim to be Peter. Or if you have a letter that you want to write, you claim to be Paul, and then people are going to be more likely to pay attention to it.
Today we're listening back to my interview with Bart Ehrman. He's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, I'm wondering about the consequences of saying that many of the books of the Bible are forgeries. In other words, could these findings make someone lose his or her faith in Christianity?
Well, it's certainly possible. People who think that the Bible has no errors in it, that it's a completely inerrant revelation from God, will definitely have problems with this. But that would be mainly people who are either fundamentalists or very conservative evangelical Christians. The views that I lay out in my book, they're radical to the extent that I'm calling these things forgeries, but they're not radical to the extent that I'm saying Paul did not write 6 of these letters. That's widely known among scholars, and it's widely taught in seminaries and divinity schools around the country, so that most ministers of mainline churches throughout the country, so I'm talking about Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Roman Catholic, they learned this in seminary about the Pauline letters, and they obviously didn't lose their faith. So I think what happens is that people need to look at this kind of historical judgment and consider their faith in light of it. And maybe what needs to happen is not that they lose their faith, but that they change their faith.
The Bible can really be read in 2 ways, can it, as a book of history and a book of faith?
Yes. My book on forgery is not meant to attack the Bible as a book of faith. I'm not attacking the theology of the Bible. I'm not saying that the theology is wrong or that the ethics that it proclaims shouldn't be followed. I am looking at it as a historical document and trying to understand it within its own historical context. And that does create a certain kind of irony, because when looked at historically, these books, in fact, are written by people claiming to be someone other than who they were, and so they were lying about it. Does that affect what their theological points of view are? Well, not necessarily. You can still accept the theological claims of the Bible and recognize that the books that proclaimed these views were written by people who were lying about their identity to deceive their readers.
However, I do notice that some of the books that Paul did not write have a distinctly different and more negative view of women than the books that Paul did write.
Yes, this is an important finding. People often, especially I think more liberal Christians, often look upon Paul as having a somewhat misogynist tendency, that he puts women down and his views are somewhat oppressive of women. And of course, in some Christian denominations today, women aren't allowed to preach, or in the Catholic Church, women aren't allowed to be priests. And this is largely based on the teachings of Paul, because there are passages in the letters of Paul in which Paul says that women are to be silent, they're to be submissive to men, they're not to exercise any authority. In 1 Timothy, the author says that women will be saved by having children. So basically, you have to be submissive and pregnant. And so these passages are used by people today in order to decide what women can do in the church. And the reality is, Paul, in fact, was not against women or against women having leadership roles in the churches. Quite the contrary, Paul himself supported women and women's roles.
Now, let's move on to another example of forgery in the New Testament, and these are 2 letters that are normally attributed to St. Peter. But you say he didn't write either of them. How do you know that?
Well, what I argue in the book is that one reason for knowing that Peter did not write 1st or 2nd Peter is that Peter almost certainly could not write. Probably at this time, 90% of the empire was illiterate, unable to read, let alone write. The best estimates for Palestine at this time are that the literacy rate was around 3%. So 3% of the population in Palestine, where Peter was from, could read. Far fewer than that could write, let alone compose. Now, 1st and 2nd Peter are not simply written as kind of simple treatises. They're, in fact, highly complex, and they're written in very good Greek. Peter, of course, was an Aramaic-speaking person without an education. He was a lower-class fisherman who almost certainly was illiterate and couldn't read, let alone write.
Couldn't Peter have used some kind of a secretary, perhaps, and dictated his thoughts?
Yes, well, that is commonly argued, even by scholars. And so one of the things that I try to do in my book is to show why that almost certainly did not happen. What I do is I look at what we know about secretaries in the ancient world. Almost always when secretaries were used by somebody, they were used through dictation, where the person would dictate something and the secretary would write it down word for word. Now, the problem is that Peter himself almost certainly didn't know Greek. Whoever wrote 1 Peter was highly fluent in Greek. So even if the person was dictating, he would have had to compose and orally present the letter in Greek, but that almost certainly couldn't be Peter.
Now, many people may or may not realize that there were lots of Gospels and sacred writings that were circulating in the early centuries of Christianity. I often call these the books that didn't make the cut when the New Testament was put together. How was it decided what books would go in the final text of what we call the Bible or the New Testament today?
It was a drawn-out process. What most people don't realize is that the first time anybody listed our 27 books of the New Testament and said, these are the books and no others, none of the other Gospels, none of the other epistles, just these 27. The first time that happened was in the year 367. It was a church father named Athanasius. So for 300 years, people were debating these things. There never was a church council that decided these things in the early church for the entire church. It really emerged as a consensus opinion among people who had similar theologies, who decided what the correct theology would be and which books ought to be included.
And many of the people that were writing these, what are often called the apocryphal Gospels and so forth, were using sacred writings often to make a case for something. In your book, you quote a number, for example, that seem to have a very negative view of the human body and of sexuality, and others that were virulently anti-Semitic. Can you say more about what kind of movements were circulating in those days?
Well, there were enormous debates in early Christianity about things like, is the body to be valued or not, or is the body something to be discarded? And that related to views of Jesus. Did Jesus really have a human body, or was he so completely divine that he didn't have real flesh? And so people were debating what the relationship of Christianity to Judaism is. Do we keep the Old Testament, or do we throw it out as a book of a wrathful God, as opposed to the New Testament? And so there were large debates about women. Should women have roles in the church or not? Different books were written in order to support various points of view on each of these and other topics. And the best way to get your point of view across was to claim to be an apostle. So that if you had a point of view that, say, Jesus didn't really have a human body, then you would write a gospel that would show that he wasn't really human, and you would claim to be Peter.
Now, you were raised yourself as a fundamentalist evangelical. You went to Moody Bible Institute. And you know, I think, how negatively your former faith community might react to scholarship like yours. What would you say to them about believing in your scholarship on the one hand and still finding meaning in the Bible?
I think that people need to look at scholarship and not accept it or reject it because it just happens to agree with the points of view they already have. I think it's important to look at what scholars are saying and look at what the evidence is and then make a decision. If it means having to change what you believe about the Bible or believe about God or believe about Jesus, then if the facts seem to be taking you in a certain direction, you should go with the facts. And I don't think that necessarily this kind of scholarship will destroy anybody's faith. I think it simply might modify their faith so that they have a more informed faith, of a faith that knows something about the history of early Christianity. The opposite of an informed faith is an ignorant faith. And I simply don't think that ignorant faith does anybody any good.